After over a decade of being a dead franchise, Gungrave returns with vengeance, very much in the same vein as its slumbering Necroid protagonist. Gungrave isn't a particularly well-regarded franchise. In fact, most people seem to know it from the 26-episode anime series, but it started life as a PlayStation 2 game. It was a game with a very simple premise: shoot absolutely everything. It was the brainchild of artist Yasuhiro Nightow, who many may know from his work on Trigun. Nightow's art direction on the game was very much inspired by Western comic books, and this is most obvious when we examine the character Beyond the Grave, or just Grave as he's usually called. It's a character design that immediately jumps out at you, not too dissimilar from the cover of a comic book. Grave was a pastiche of every kind of awesome action movie trope you could think of. His appearance was based on Antonio Banderas in Desperado, and his signature coffin of weapons owes a lot to a certain Franco Nero character. His simple motivation for vengeance brings to mind genres such as the spaghetti western and the heroic bloodshed of Hong Kong action cinema. The latter was defined by its use of dual-wielding pistols and a graceful, almost ballet-like portrayal of gunplay, something Gungrave captures with its gameplay. Holding down the fire button while Grave isn't moving triggers something called burst mode, where he unleashes a quick barrage of bullets, as well as a stylish shooting animation. This right here is what you'll spend most of your time in Gungrave doing. It's not a complicated game by any means. The creators wanted it to be something crazy you could pick up and play for 10 minutes here and there. Possibly if it was late at night and you was too drunk to concentrate on anything more complicated. Nightow himself outright said that the story of this game didn't matter a whole lot, and that he himself doesn't pay attention to the story in video games. Not that that's gonna stop me from talking about it anyway. At any rate, I think these kinds of games are important to have. The shut off your brain kind. It's easy to look at the first Gungrave and criticise it for its surface level gameplay, but the salarymen need something to play when they come home drunk at 4 AM after an evening of karaoke. This is actually something the creators said, by the way, I'm not making this up. And make no mistake, there is an artistry to that kind of game that's understated, and Gungrave nails it. This retrospective will be going into why this first entry and its sequel are such hidden gems on the PS2.
It's too bad you won't be able to review the third game.
What do you mean?
Isn't it a VR game?
What? A VR game? Again? First they bring back Zone of the Enders in VR, and now Gungrave? At this rate, we're gonna get Bullet Witch and Persona 1 in VR too. So yeah, the third game is in VR. But apparently there are also plans to make a true sequel, titled Gungrave GORE. This video will only be covering the first two games we have, so let us begin.
Oh, fiddlesticks! I did it again!
Gungrave opens with an incredibly somber scene. An injured Mikurasagi dragging a case of weapons through a dystopian city. She arrives at a dingy room with a man named Dr. T, and the resurrected corpse of a man formerly known as Brandon Heat. The three of them had been driven underground by a mafia-like organization called the Millennium, run by the former best friend of Brandon turned arch-nemesis, Harry McDowell. However, once these incredibly dramatic and effective cutscenes end, the game switches gears and becomes more over the top and silly. Every stage is introduced with the text "kick their ass," and you can even do this awesome pose whenever you want. This offers no tactical advantage whatsoever. It's just cool looking. You don't manually aim your guns in Gungrave. It's all done automatically. If you're facing in the general direction of the enemy, chances are you're gonna shoot them. Accuracy isn't really what this game is about. You don't have any bullets and you never reload. It's about relentlessly shooting anyone and everything and keeping the beat high. The beat is kind of like your combo meter. As long as you don't stop hitting things, the number will continue to rise. This is also how you charge your demolition shot, which are extra powerful attacks you can unleash whenever you're feeling slightly overwhelmed. You also have a sluggish melee attack and a dive button, which you'll be using a lot as it speeds up your shooting, and also because there's no strafe in this game. It's tank controls. A lot of the gameplay boils down to relentless offense. You don't really need to take cover or anything like that. If you take damage, it'll come out of this blue shield bar first, which regenerates after you don't take damage for a while. This makes it so that you don't need to worry too much about regular enemies. They're not so much obstacles as they are fodder for increasing your beat count. Later stages would include more difficult types of enemies, such as the big guys with the rocket launchers, and the close range heavy machine gun types. The stages are pretty much linear shooting galleries that are punctuated by end stage bosses. This is where the game's only challenge lies. The boss fights are what you would expect from a Japanese developed game. They have multiple attack patterns that you have to memorize and avoid. Perhaps my favourite boss fight is Bear Walking. Specifically his second phase when he turns into a giant fist on wheels. I love this because it's one of those bosses that is constantly changing based on your proximity to him. You've got to maintain the right distance. If you get too far away, he'll start throwing helicopters at you, and if you get too close, he'll start punching you. There really is no safe distance though, and you'll constantly be avoiding attacks. It's good classic 3D boss design that never becomes boring. The bosses themselves are incredibly fun and interesting characters. They're usually mutated monstrosities with a slew of crazy abilities. Gungrave is always throwing weird and interesting stuff at you, even during the final stage, which is a massive departure from the urban environments we've been gunning through up until now. It's a tower leading to a nest of alien-like beings, the results of Harris' experiments with a drug called Seed. Visually, Gungrave still looks pretty good to this day. The art direction helps hide the limitations of the PS2. There's a cel-shaded look to the environments that really makes them stand out. Usually games of this era don't hold up very well, especially when the colour palette is as dark as this. However, Gungrave's expressive characters and environments help mitigate this. The controls can feel a little clunky at times, but it never stops it from being fun. In fact, I think the clunkiness only adds to its character. It puts you in the shoes of Grave. The man is built like a tank, and he's carrying around a massive coffin of weapons. He's not going to be as agile as your typical shooter protagonist. At least, not until the sequel. Gungrave Overdose was released 2 years after the first game in 2004, exclusively for the PlayStation 2, as the series has always been. Oh hey, so what the hell is that?
It's a VR headset so you can play the Gungrave VR game.
Oh goody. Wait a minute, where did you even find that?
You have like 400 of them in the underground library.
Oh yeah, I did buy a whole bunch of those, didn't I? I got them the second I found out you could play porn on them. The future of VR is hentai sachi. Do you know what it was that allowed VHS to beat Betamax in the format wars? It was the porn.
I was wondering what the point of this game was.
Anyway, where was I? Overdose is a very different beast from the first game. It's a much more ambitious sequel that adds more content and mechanics. Firstly, let's talk about the improvements Overdose brings to the table. Your character's movements are now much faster, and the general pace of the gameplay has been sped up as well. There's no longer a run button like in the first game. Your character is always in run mode. This fits with Grave's new, less bulky design. It's a cool new look, although I do miss the cowboy hat. Melee attacks now feel much more fluid, and you can actually string together combos. One of the things the developers wanted to improve upon in this entry was the difficulty, and it shows. Your character isn't quite as unstoppable as they were in the first game. There's generally more enemies on screen, and there's a lot more types of them. The rocket launcher enemies are back from the first game, and they're a massive pain. Feels like they got way too carried away with these enemies because every single room has at least 2 of them. They're able to stagger you, which is incredibly annoying and slows down the pace. They did implement a cool new feature though that fixes them somewhat, where you can hit the rockets back at them with a melee attack. It's a good idea that feels a little too overused. Your blue armor bar returns from the first game, with one key difference. It only recharges when you're not doing anything. If you're shooting, it's not regenerating. In the first game, as long as you didn't take damage, you would regenerate. This is an incredibly annoying change that encourages you to take cover. I could have done without it, personally. The enemies at the start of the game are your typical mob goons, but you eventually work your way up to more worthy foes, such as guys with swords that can block bullets, guys with shields that can also block bullets, heavily armoured soldiers, tanks, helicopters, and other weird monstrosities. There's a lot of variety on display here that makes this one more replayable than the first one. Its surface level gameplay now has layers. You need to switch up your strategy slightly when dealing with certain enemies. It's no longer a mindless shooting gallery. The game does fall short in some areas, however. The environments and overall stage design are far less interesting than the first games. While the first game had a timeless appeal, this is very much a product of its time. It's a lot blander looking. Many of the stages are like this. There's even small bits of platforming here and there that really wasn't necessary. I believe this was done to improve the slowdown in the original game. It did chug at certain points. And while it's true that Overdose runs better than the first game, I think I may have preferred the more detailed environments. Something else I found to be lacking is the boss fights. They're pretty forgettable and highlight a lot of the game's design flaws. Mainly its camera and targeting reticule. The reticule is essential during most of the boss fights, and at times, it feels like the bigger threat. It's one of those types of targeting systems. You've seen it before. The kind that automatically unlocks when you lose sight of the enemy, or when they get too far away. This is an issue that was a lot less prevalent in the first game. It was still there, but the targeting system there wasn't quite as essential as it is in Overdose. You could play most of the game without even using it. Most of the boss fights are pretty easy, but they're not very fun. Just frustrating. I may as well talk about the final boss because it's almost experimental in how bad it is. You spend most of it moving in slow motion, and it's a frustrating mess. It's not difficult though, because you're pretty much invincible. It's just a big waste of time. There's also an odd lack of background music in a lot of places. Awkward silence doesn't quite fit the tone they were going for. Overdose greatly expands on the lore of the first game, and puts a lot more emphasis on the narrative. We have a lot more cutscenes that break up the stages. There's also a lot of dialogue between the cast.
A ghost haunting an electric guitar, and a blind, dead soldier. Quite a crew we've got here.
Grave is still mute for the most part, which necessitated a simple story in the first game. The sequel remedies this by introducing two new playable characters, Yuji Kabane and Rocket Billy Red Cadillac, which is objectively the coolest name ever. The plot follows a more mature Mika as she resurrects GORE for another mission. This time it's to destroy the dangerous drug seed that has been flooding the streets by the Corleone family. This is a mission that is shared by Yuji and Rocket Billy, who have similar powers to GORE. They form an unlikely alliance as they battle their way to the game's villain, Gurino Corleone, aided by a few returning faces from the first game, and even one from the anime. His reasons for flooding the streets with seed ties back into the unexpected alien head in the first game. The drug seed is actually of an extraterrestrial origin. Gurino had made a deal with the aliens, that in exchange for technology he would spread their drug. Yeah, at this point the plot diverges a little too far from that simple gangster vengeance story. This is a fault that even the creators admit to in the art book. Nevertheless, it fits the bonkers nature of the plot. We've got zombie men, ice aliens, and a guy that kills enemies with the power of rock and roll.
Hello, everybody!
Sure, alien drug, whatever. The plot to this game is an absolute delight. The first game had a little bit of story, but it never really slowed down to linger on it. Overdose, on the other hand, does. Possibly because of how well received the story-heavy anime was. My favourite example of this is a scene towards the end, where the game stops to illustrate how much these characters have suffered. We hear about Yuji's backstory as a soldier, and how he became a discarded experiment.
I was surrounded by garbage and gobs of flesh from Gurino's other experiments.
And then we have this scene with Mika that expands on the game's themes of family and loyalty. Over the years, she's drained a lot of her own blood so that it can eventually be used by GORE, should the need ever arise. It shows just how far she's willing to go for the sake of her mission.
It's like we're all one big family, and this may be the only thing that I can really do for GORE.
It's a far cry from the defenseless girl we saw in the first game. The oddball crew of Overdose is a lot of fun. They all feel incredibly three-dimensional. It adds a lot of character to what could have been just a standard action game. It's about time I address the best thing about this. It's Yuji. Yuji is a fantastic character.
Hey, Kabane, keep it down. You don't have to yell in my ear.
Shut your trap, brat.
Why does this man not have his own franchise? He's a strange mix of elements. On one hand, he's got this dry, indifferent attitude that's quite amusing, and on the other, the man is having the absolute time of his life in battle. His backstory seems like it has all the makings of a brooding, dark 90s comic book character. The kind that never cracks a smile or shows any kind of emotion. They avoid that completely though. Yuji is a fun, badass character that's never taken too seriously. I'd go as far as saying he steals the game from GORE. He's also the best character to play as, mainly because of his gun blades. They're the most satisfying melee attacks in the entire game. That's it, I'm opening a Character Hall of Fame. All the best characters that we've talked about on this channel are going in it. So, Yuji Kabane, you are in it.
By the way, GORE, I'm 17 now, almost grown up.
Overall, Overdose is a more than worthy sequel to the first game. It improves on some things, falls short on others, but it's definitely an underrated gem. Honestly, I have a hard time deciding which of the games is my favourite. I think I might have to go with Overdose though. There's more depth and variety to it. Throughout a lot of this video, I've been using this art book as a reference. It contains a lot of interviews with Nightow and many other people who worked on the games. I bring this up because this book is awesome. It's 2 art books in one for a start, and it's all translated. It's got a lot about both the first game and Overdose, and there's even some anime stuff in there as well. Plus, the artwork is really nice. Pick up a copy if you can, because as far as art books go, this is great value. Since Gungrave isn't that huge a franchise, you can still find copies really cheap, which makes me wonder how it ever got released in the first place. So I watched the trailer for this VR Gungrave thing, and it does not look good at all. It shows none of the artistry those original games had, but I don't really care about the VR title. It's Gungrave GORE that I'm interested in.
Why is this schoolgirl so insistent that I touch her breasts? We only just met. I don't know about this. And we're both girls. Well, as long as you're fine with it, I suppose I don't mind.
Sachi, stop playing those degenerate hentai games while I'm talking about Gungrave.
I forgot you were here! I'm sorry! I'll get right back to work, I promise!
Where was I again? Oh wait, I was done, wasn't I? Play Gungrave.
Come on, everybody! Come on, everybody! Yeah! Come on, everybody!